Cameron spent most of last week trying to stop Juncker at all costs, denouncing him as a federalist, exactly the wrong man for Britain. He got the job, as Cameron knew he would, and now the Prime Minister has to sort of start sucking up to this guy. I mean, Isabel, tell us about the phone call that we had to make last night.
Well, he made a phone call yesterday afternoon in which he congratulated Juncker on getting the job that he'd been trying to stop him from getting.
And did he have to make this phone call, or was it...
I don't know whether it's something that you have to do by sort of protocol, but he had to make it politically because he spent so long attacking Juncker that he has to now start building bridges with the guy in order to have any chance of getting anything from a renegotiation. And Downing Street were very keen to emphasise that Juncker talked about advancing British interests in Europe and addressing some of their problems. Now, whether addressing British problems is a bit like saying you'll address something that you're actually just dispatching is another matter.
Yeah. And James, how much of this strategy do you think was deliberate? I mean, I don't think they intended to get into the mess they ended up with Juncker, but once they got there, Cameron obviously thought, right, let's just press ahead. He must also have thought, but I've got to work with this guy for years, but still I'm going to go hammer and tongs at him.
Because I think he wanted to send a message to the other European leaders that when he says something, he means it.
So it's all pre-renegotiation?
Yeah, it's all a pre-placement renegotiation. I mean, there are two things to watch in the next few weeks. One is, does Angela Merkel, having kind of done the dirty on David Cameron and turned back on the assurances she gave him about stopping Juncker, does she now put together over the next few months a kind of series of measures designed to address Britain's concerns? And secondly, is the person who succeeds Hardman Van Rompuy, so the new president of the European Council, who's going to have to broker the deal between Cameron and the other 27 EU leaders over the renegotiation, is that someone Brit-friendly? Downing Street are quite clear that they want Helle Thorning-Schmidt, the Danish PM. They see her as a pragmatist, and they also think the fact that Denmark is a kind of fellow Euro out.
This is Mrs. Kinnock.
Yes, this is Neil Kinnock's daughter-in-law. And so the question there is, does Cameron get the candidate he wants in arguably the more important job for the renegotiation, and does Merkel put together a series of measures? You know, George Osborne flew to Berlin last week to see Wolfgang Schäuble, his opposite number. Schäuble has come out today and said, look, we can't lose Britain. Germany will do whatever it takes to keep Britain in. I think the big worry for Cameron, though, is that what he's learned from this Juncker experience is that Merkel can give him an assurance, and then that can be trumped by her domestic political needs. And so Cameron is never going to be able, it's never going to quite be the same again between Cameron and Merkel. He's always going to have at the back of his mind, now, is she going to turn on a sixpence when her coalition partners kick up, or when the German tabloids kick up?
But Isabel, what we have seen is a very dramatic change in tone towards the EU. I mean, the Cameron we're seeing now is almost irrecognisable from the one who was shafted by Sarkozy a couple of years ago. So do you think Cameron's going to keep his fists flying now, from now until renegotiation, if he gets the chance?
Well, he's got to, and he's also got to have a few successes now that he's failed on Juncker, because a lot of Tories do measure him by his victories in Europe, and he's actually set that out for them to do as well, because he talks about the EU budget cut, which he conveniently forgets was instigated by a rebellion in the Commons. He talks about the veto, which also wasn't quite the success he claims it was. But he needs now to notch up a few successes that show that he has got some clout in Europe, and I suppose some kind of compensation package, as James has talked about, would help him on that.
And the other great stramash at the moment is between Ed Miliband and Juncker and Cruddas. Cruddas, who we at the Spectator have tended to admire, we admire him all the more now that he seems to be calling out some of the flabbier policies and Ed Miliband's agenda. Significant because he's the guy who's in charge of Ed Miliband's policy review. He was recorded at this Compass meeting 10 days ago, deploring the way that the IPPR report, huge 2 years it took, it was condensed, he was saying, into one headline-grabbing thing about being mean to young people on benefits. James, how significant is this? I mean, have we learned now that Cruddas is at loggerheads with Ed Miliband, and that his boss is going to get policies he isn't going to like?
Well, what this story has done, and it's brought into the open, is this massive tension between, when Ed Miliband got the job, he appointed various kind of intellectuals like John Cruddas to do things for him, to think big. John Cruddas was put in charge of the policy review, kind of an intellectual renaissance for Labour. What that is running up against is the realities of the election campaign that Douglas, Alexander and Spencer Livermore want to run. John Cruddas wants this kind of beautiful whole redefinition of the state, Englishness, everything. The left reimagined socialism for the 21st century. Douglas, Alexander and Spencer Livermore give us some policies we can sell on the doorstep and that don't create too big a target for the Tories to attack. That's what this row is about.
Right. So, Isabel, where does this go next? Will Cruddas have to say how sorry he is, or can we just take it for granted that there's a fault line has been exposed within Labour Party?
I think it will be interesting to see what the next policies that come out are and how they're spun. Maybe he'll get some opportunity to, as James says, do something kind of visionary that no one quite fully understands.
But isn't time running out for vision? I mean, the Tories dropped the big society on us far too late in the campaign.
Yeah.
If you're going to have a big vision, shouldn't we have had it by now?
He's also already done quite a lot of visionary stuff, and this is the kind of tension in the Labour team, is do you have this kind of pragmatic campaign where you aim for the largest party rather than thinking you're going to go for a majority and trying to reteach the whole of the British electorate to think Labour-ish, or do you sort of...
I think the argument is that, that Mario Cuomo said you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. John Cruddas wants to kind of campaign in rhyming couplets, whereas I think Douglas Alexander wants to campaign in bullet points.
Right, and so who's going to win this battle then? I mean, the way you describe it, it's as if when John Cruddas comes out with his great big ideas, he's going to be told, no, sorry, won't work on my doorstep, so publish it as a think tank document.
I think if he does, I think if Cruddas gets kind of fewer than 30% of his ideas through, I think there will be a massive explosion. I think one of the problems for Labour is that up until about 6 months ago, the fact we knew the date of general election worked in Labour's favour. Now it works against them, because normally what you do as an opposition is you'd ring Ed Miliband and ring up John Cruddas and says, look, I'm terribly sorry, I think David Cameron's going to go to the country in October, so we're just going to have to write the manifesto now. Terribly sorry about that. Normally I'd do everything you can, but I think the government are about to cut and run. You can't do that anymore, and so Cruddas will say, no, we've got plenty of time to have an argument about what we put in the manifesto, and I want what I've been working on for the last 3 years in that.
And you say big explosion, what form might that take? Any thoughts?
I mean the big explosion is going to be stuff like this on the, not secretly taped, but on the record. I mean, John Cruddas' interview with the New Statesman last week was a kind of real cry of pain, you know, decrying leadership, top trumps, and all this. I think if his intellectual prospectus is rejected, I think he's going to make quite clear the disillusionment that has caused.
I think there's also already across the Shadow Cabinet been a greater willingness on the part of the people in the Shadow Cabinet to brief against one another, and I think you'll just see more and more and more of that.
So why do they think they're going to lose now, or what?
I think there's lots of different factions. There are some who want, like John Cruddas, to advance their own view of how to fight an election. There are some who don't care so much about this election and want to think about the next election when they could be glorious leader. And there are some who are disagreeing with the way things are being communicated as well.
I think there's also a kind of a third or a fourth school, which is, look, we could, remarkably they say in private, that we could win this election. It could be that the fact that UKIP are eating into the Tory vote, the Lib Dem defectors, let's not blow this, let's just play this safe, let's get over the line.
But they're not going to win if they keep doing things like this to themselves, are they? This is the irony.
The interesting question is, at the moment, these Labour divisions have been clearer in recent weeks than they have been for a long time. Does that begin to have any effect on the polls, where Labour still have a reasonable lead, which has actually ticked back up a little bit after the European election?